Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. It is Thursday, therefore it's a ladies' night, and I'm joined by the cream of the co-host crop, Dalia Gebrial. Dalia, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. I'm very sorry that I couldn't join you in the studio today, but I'm hoping from next week when we come back after the Christmas break, we'll be able to be in the studio together, which I think will be super exciting. I've missed the double host or sort of in-studio vibe. We've not had it for like 4 years, but yeah, I'm super excited to be in the studio with you.
The feeling is always mutual. I can't wait to get my first two hosts set up, which I'll be doing tomorrow with Michael Walker. Coming up tonight, 2 protesters have been arrested on suspicion of chanting globalise the Intifada. Trump's chief of staff has given a tell-all interview on the chaos within the White House, and we speak to Palestinian artist Barghouti about the Gaza charity single being pitched for a Christmas #1. Reminder before we get started, the pre-Christmas deadline for shipping at the Novara Media Shop is upon us. If you want to get some of our great books, clothes, or accessories for a loved one, you have until midnight tonight. As ever, all of the profits go towards supporting our work. That link is shop.novaramedia.com. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. A European Union summit kicked off today, but it's no friendly affair. Likely to be one of the most fraught and consequential of the bloc's recent history, the key question is whether to turn 90 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets over to Ukraine in the form of a loan. Kiev has said that without extra funding, Ukraine will run out of money needed to finance its defence in the next 3 to 4 months. But European leaders are split on whether to get involved, with some seeing the decision as an existential necessity to secure European safety. In that camp is Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk.
Either money today or blood tomorrow. And I am not talking about Ukraine only, I am talking about Europe. And this is our decision to make, and only ours. I think all European leaders have to finally rise to this occasion.
Later, Tusk also said this: Polish independence would be under threat if it turns out that as a consequence of poor decisions or a lack of action from Europe, Ukraine was forced to surrender. I want this finally sink in for everyone. Not just for our colleagues here in Europe, but for everyone in Poland as well. That when we talk about the necessity of supporting Ukraine using these Russian funds, it is because we know full well that Ukrainian independence pushes the risk of aggression or war away from Polish borders. Conversely, the fall of Ukraine as a result of this war would mean a direct threat to Poland. Other European leaders, however, see poking the Russian bear as an existential risk, like Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who is seen himself often as aligned with Russia's President Vladimir Putin.
Guarantees for what? The whole idea is a stupid one. To take away the money of somebody. There are 2 countries which are in war, yeah? It's not European Union, Russia and Ukraine. And somebody, European Union, would like to take away the money of one of the warriors parties and then to give it to another one. It's a marching into the war. So the Belgian Prime Minister is right. We should not do that.
That was a reference to Belgian Prime Minister Bart De Wever, who has fought hard against handing seized Russian assets to Ukraine. Brussels, as a major financial centre, hosts the Euroclear Securities House that holds nearly 90% of Russian state assets in the European Union, amounting to nearly 190 billion euros. For De Wever, that means that Belgium would be exposing itself to greater risk than any other EU country in handing a chunk of that money to Ukraine. And he said he'll use his country's veto to block any attempt to force the issue, saying that fellow EU leaders would have to, quote, throw him out if they tried to override his concerns. De Wever has said he wants a mechanism that means any risks would be shared across all of the EU's 27 members. That's not just the risk of retaliation by Russia, but the financial risk that would come with an international court or Washington demanding that the money be handed back to Russia after half of it had been given to Ukraine. De Wever said this: We've set conditions, and they're clear and well known. Everyone considers them rational and reasonable. I simply have to get these conditions. There are deal breakers that need to be removed from the text, period. Otherwise I'll have to be thrown out. I'm not giving up, and I think I have a very good chance. If we jump, we all jump together. If it's completely mutualised and sealed off for our country, then we'll jump into the abyss along with all the Europeans and hope the parachute will hold us. then we will. Many EU leaders have spent a huge amount of political capital on continued and even heightened financial and military support for Ukraine. And even Novara was not against that in principle, saying this. The alternative, not to finance Ukraine, is not an option. Then the country will collapse. And that is the ultimate geopolitical disaster for Europe, one we will feel for decades to come. From then on, we will no longer be a player in the world. If we have to part ways in chaos after this summer, then it's over. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke at the opening session of the summit, and he laid out the very different political reality the country now finds itself in.
We are in the war in the United States, they are the decision makers who can really stop Putin. And I count on this. But I really count on pressure from the United States. And now the United States more mediating, it's true they're mediating between us. But I really wanted very much them more steps pressuring Russia, because I think that Putin doesn't want to stop this war, but he can if the United States will pressure more.
But in a speech on Wednesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin showed no signs of backing down.
The goals of the special military operation will undoubtedly be achieved. We would prefer to do this and address the root causes of the conflict through diplomacy. If the opposing side and their foreign patrons refuse to engage in substantive discussions, Russia will achieve the liberation of its historical lands by military means.
In that speech, Putin also described European leaders as, quote, little pigs, blaming them and former United States President Joe Biden for provoking Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He also accused them of scuppering a peace deal drawn up by current President Donald Trump, quote, in hopes of making a killing from the collapse of our country. He also said it was nonsense that Russia was planning to attack any other European country and that he wanted to resume talks with Europe, adding, quote, if not with the current politicians, then when the political elites in Europe are replaced. He went on to say this. Shortly after the Soviet Union had fallen apart, we thought we would quickly become members of the civilized family of European nations and the civilized Western family more broadly. Today it turns out that civilization there is non-existent and degradation is all that there is there. For me personally, I take sympathy with Novara's position. Now, I think you have to meet hard power with hard power, and the threat of international agreements in terms of the finances that are held in Europe by Russia, I think is a bit of a false dilemma that they're being put in. And whereas if you do show that hard power, it cannot all fall on Brussels. And I have sympathy with this position. So, well, if you're going to make those assurances for Ukraine, then it has to be all the European nations taking the same amount of risk rather than it all placed singularly on Belgium. What do you think about that, Dalia?
It's not just a situation whereby there is a militaristic risk, risk of military escalation, which I think is very real and, what we're going to come on to later in the show. But there is the question of if a settlement was reached, and all of this money from these frozen Russian assets have been liquidated and given to Ukraine, the question then becomes, if there is a settlement reached, how do countries that hold a lot of these assets recuperate them and return them back post-sanctions? And that is the kind of financial risk that a country like Belgium cannot shoulder alone, of course. And that's the point of the EU is to collectivize these kinds of risks. So I can completely understand why he would have these trepidations. But I think I want to actually zoom out a little bit and look at what another element of this story, and something that I've been following quite a lot since the invasion of Ukraine, is the response of Europe and Britain. I know Britain is not in the EU anymore, but it's kind of implicated in a lot of the same relationships of how the EU has responded to private Russian wealth, very shortly after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, we saw Europe and Britain move very swiftly to identify and seize the assets of Russian oligarchs who had been using Europe's financial system to hide their wealth. And when I say using, I don't mean that they were using it in some kind of underground way. They were actually using the system as it was designed to be used. Since the 1990s, Britain, London, the financial centre of Britain, and financial centres all across Europe had marketed themselves as essentially a gateway to the world of offshore financing to the global elite, much of which included the very, very wealthy political elite of Russia and business elite of Russia. And that's kind of how we've ended up in the situation that we're in now, which is that, you have these incredibly lucrative financial centers that have huge amounts of money passing through them, and yet none of that money is actually improving the lives of people in countries like Britain and more broadly within Europe. It's just sort of passing through these states to go on to the world of offshore. And, we're continually told that there is no way to tackle the secrecy of these financial flows. We can't trace them. We can't subject them to any kind of regulation. We can't find out who the true owners and beneficiaries of all these shell companies are. And yet, when it was seen to be geopolitically necessary and geopolitically important, we were able to almost immediately identify and sanction and regulate all of this wealth. That it was one of the most aggressive actions that governments of Europe have taken in decades against private wealth. And it goes to show that actually we do have the mechanisms and the power to regulate private wealth, to identify these illicit financial flows. And Britain especially, but also other countries within the EU, can close tax loopholes, can curb the secrecy and protections that mean that we can't tax wealth, can restrict offshore ownership of these assets. Because once Russia invaded Ukraine, it did many of those things. But when it comes to regulating this kind of private wealth and closing these loopholes in order to, say, build a welfare state or provide, stop our housing stock from being bought up by the global elite and instead actually using it to house people who need homes, we seem to be unable to do it. So for me, I think that it goes to show that every day that our governments choose not to take action against not illicit, but kind of secret financial flows and the huge flows of money that take place through our financial centers. Every day they choose to not regulate it, to not tax it, to not make sure that that wealth is distributed equally. It's not because they can't do it. It's because they choose not to do it. Because when we have a geopolitical disaster like the Russia-Ukraine war or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it becomes very clear that we actually do have the power to not only regulate and tax that wealth, but actually to even liquidate that wealth and hand it over to another state. Now, of course, the military risks and the financial risks of that are very clear and are very, prescient. But for me, what I always find so interesting with how the conversation around Russian wealth in Europe and, the wealth of oligarchs being stored in various parts of Europe is how quickly a lot of this money that apparently we can't do anything about, we couldn't possibly tax, everyone would leave, it would be a disaster. It's a shame that it took this egregious attack on Ukraine for us to actually be able to see that it is possible to regulate and manage the movement of that wealth. And every day that our governments don't do it, it's because they're choosing not to.
It was quite funny. I remember when this conversation was having right at the start of the invasion, and all of the libertarian think tanks going, no, we can't confiscate the Russian assets because that will undermine the property rights. That would mean that other people would ask for this to happen in other cases. And you very succinctly put why that's the case, that they would be so scared of that becoming the norm. Also, very interesting for Vladimir Putin to say, we thought we'd be part of the Western family. I'm like, you are the beneficiary of neoliberal shock doctrine. You're friends with all of the very rich oligarchs that were created by hyper-capitalist shock therapy, which is very much what the neoliberal West wanted. In fact, MI6 allegedly intervened in 1999 to try and get him elected, to make sure that Gennady Zyuganov was not the Russian president, right? really weird to get everything you want and then suddenly say, oh, well, it's terrible. I have to invade Ukraine now because it's not what I wanted from the West. I mean, take some nerve. There's very much the feeling in Europe that we're not more than a few missteps away from war with Russia. This was NATO Chief Mark Rutte speaking last week.
Conflict is at our door. Russia has brought war back to Europe. And we must be prepared for the scale of war our grandparents and great-grandparents endured. Imagine it. A conflict reaching every home, every workplace. Destruction, mass mobilization, millions displaced, widespread suffering and extreme losses. It is a terrible thought.
For European leaders, the strategy for avoiding war, or so they say, is massive rearmament to bolster their country's security in the face of what they see as a growing threat from Russia and insecurity about the reliability of the United States. It's a risky strategy, of course, assuming it's even an honest one. But on the subject of building up Britain's capacity to fight a war, some armchair generals think that they've got some better ideas.
And we have been ignoring it. Our politicians have been ignoring it. But one of the reasons they've done that is because it's quite convenient not to have to spend a huge chunk of our national income on defence and spending it on, nurses or free this, free that, a bit more welfare, everybody. That's what people prefer, isn't it?
Well, one can see, and certainly I'm sure the present government would say that's what they were voted in on. But unfortunately, the situation is rapidly changing. And if we spend all the money, all the government money on welfare and other things, then we will not have a defence to be able to carry on in the way that people would like to live in this country.
I'm wondering if we could solve a lot of this with, hey, no more welfare for anyone under the age of 30. You're joining the military. That might focus minds in lots of different ways, eh?
Now, I don't mean to speak for an entire generation, but I will. And I think that the last two people who could convince me to go and fight in the trenches of Eastern Europe are someone so posh he's called Hamish de Breton Gordon and a Gobby Harridan who steals a living spouting uninformed gibberish for Rupert Murdoch. What do you think?
It just goes to show that for so many of not just the journalistic class, but NATO as well, the cranking up of the war machine is not the existential threat to them in the way that it is to us. In fact, it's quite the opposite. To them, they are so, and this particularly goes for NATO as well, so deeply embedded with the military-industrial complex, which is a voracious and nihilistic industry that relies on war and relies on violence and conflict in order to keep going. For them, it is an existential risk to not be at constant war, because if you're not at constant war or not constantly on the brink of war, you cease to be necessary. You cease to be, it's your raison d'etre. And it is terrifying that our political class, political decision makers have such deep vested interests in an industry that is existentially committed to violence, war, and conflict. And that has been the underlying principle that has come to a head right now. But the power of the military-industrial complex in our economy and therefore within our politics has been going on for a very, very long time. And look, when it comes to the EU and with Russia, the EU has been in this stalemate now with Russia for coming up to 4 years. And it goes without saying that, of course, as well as this being the idea of a war with Russia being an absolute catastrophe for regular people across Europe, it is currently a catastrophe that is destroying Ukrainian society. And it is in many ways a crisis for the standing of the EU in the world. The EU has thrown its political and financial weight at this war in an attempt to resolve it without, we are led to believe, militaristically escalating, although I do think that there are many people who have positions of power within these institutions that have been deliberately trying to nudge us towards this crossroads, towards this stalemate. And especially now that we don't seem to be able to rely on the power of the US, which Europe has historically counted on in these kinds of moments, it's almost like the EU has backed itself in a corner where, on the one hand, there is this understandable sense that there needs to be an escalation in strategy as far as they are concerned. This is not my perspective, this is theirs. But on the other hand, it really is a question of what is the EU? What is the stature of the EU in this new multipolar world? And when you view the world through the eyes of the military-industrial complex, which is the status quo in this context, it is actually not the worst case scenario that we end up in a tragic and catastrophic war that not only costs potentially hundreds of thousands of lives, but as Julia Hartley-Brewer puts it there, means that we can't spend money, apparently, on the things that actually matter to us, on housing, on paying nurses, on paying doctors, teachers, all these things, these life-giving politics that we are fighting for. Of course, for many of them, there's not much money. For many of the people in power, there's not a lot of money in that, especially if it's provided by the public sector. And so this is why so many of us have been fighting against the military-industrial complex for so long, and at many times when it's been deeply unpopular, because we know that so long as this force is underpinning our geopolitics, as long as this industry that relies on war and conflict and violence is driving our geopolitics, we were always going to end up in a moment like this where it begins to feel, or it's made to feel, like escalating war that not only happens abroad or outside, because so far, Europe has done quite a good job of externalizing the violence and externalizing the war and conflict to outside of its borders. But it was only going to be a matter of time before that threatens to encroach into mainland Europe.
I also like this idea that we should cut welfare to be able to afford more military spending. I'm like, well, what would we be fighting for in that case? The country's already gone to hell in a handcart. We already have a public realm that's been totally degraded by 15 years of austerity, by 46 years of neoliberalism. And the generation that they're asking to go out and fight are the ones who have barely had a social contract working in their favour for a very long time, who can't afford to get on the housing ladder, some of them still living with their parents, having seen wages stagnate for a decade, with a healthcare system that doesn't particularly work, and paying 9% taxes in some cases on student loans and educations that we were told we should get, the people who we're going to be fighting to defend never had to pay for. I mean, Julia Hartley-Brewer, if you're watching right now, you want to go and defend the motherland? By all means, pick up a rifle and go and do it for all of the things that you get that I don't. Very simple. It's up to you. Now, on the subject of war with Russia, our own Stephen Methan has a new deep dive video coming out on this channel on December 30th. Called Would You Survive a War with Russia? The piece examines how quickly we could find ourselves in conflict with Russia and how it might start, and what the unimaginable consequences of it could be. Here's a sneak peek.
Now, while a European-Russian war would certainly involve both sides using various forms of electronic warfare to demoralize civilian populations while carrying out hybrid attacks on civilian infrastructure, the methods would be largely invisible. And even at the hotter stages of a full engagement between the two powers, one that brought civil targets into view, cities and towns would still only be attacked with familiar, yet nonetheless horrifying conventional weapons. These could include drone swarms, missile strikes, and aerial attacks. But in that situation, things could escalate even more quickly, at which point weapons not used in living memory, or even never used, might suddenly pose a growing threat. One such weapon became an object of speculation early last year.
Cryptic warning from the House Intelligence Committee chairman.
Referring to a foreign military capability.
Russian nukes in space.
The idea here, according to the sources, is not to use the explosion itself, which is how we traditionally think of a nuclear weapon or a nuke. Instead, the explosion produces an electromagnetic pulse.
Look, we don't know if those news stories were about an actual Russian threat or just a ruse to drum up public faith in Western support for Ukraine. And nobody outside of their respective militaries and governments knows whether Russia or any Western country has such a weapon. But both the US and the former Soviet Union have experimented with them.
As I said, that video will be premiering on Novara Media's channel on December 30th. In the wake of the anti-Semitic terror attack in Bondi Beach in Sydney, the UK political and media class have been desperately trying to shoehorn it into the UK debate around Israel and Palestine. We reported yesterday that this has led to the guidance from the Metropolitan Police to arrest people who chant "globalise the Intifada" at protests, and this is exactly what has happened. During a Palestine Coalition protest in London on Wednesday, the Metropolitan Police confirmed that they have arrested 2 people on racially aggravated public order offences for shouting slogans calling for Intifada. This is the reality of Britain in 2025, when just saying an Arabic word can get you arrested. Again, it is worth reiterating that this is on the grounds of racial aggravation, despite the fact there is no racial component to this whatsoever. The call for Intifada is anti-colonial resistance to the occupation of Palestine. The terminology would be the same regardless of whatever entity was the occupier. It just so happens that in this case, it's an apartheid ethno-state. And even then, this is all in the context of a terror attack on the other side of the world by 2 people who are completely unconnected to Palestine or the International Palestine Solidarity Movement. Earlier this week, it was Health Secretary Wes Streeting doing the rounds trying to defend this gratuitous revocation of free expression. Today, it was Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips, although she seemed a little less prepared.
Do you see the word intifada as having overtones of violence, Minister?
I think calling for to globalise the intifada can only really have. I'm not sure what other interpretation there is of intifada other than like an uprising.
It's intifada, of course.
Intifada.
Yes.
Sorry, excuse me.
Yes, that's right.
Is to call for uprising. And look, we've seen what can happen in an environment where the idea of calling people to arms or violence, that is a very real thing that is happening across our country.
Oh, so much for global enchilada, eh, Jess Phillips? Imagine all doing the rounds, knowing that you're going to get asked about all of the discourse around the Intifada arrests and the new changing guidance from the Metropolitan Police, and not learn how to pronounce the word Intifada. And even then, it doesn't necessarily mean violence, and it does just mean uprising or shaking off in Arabic. That doesn't necessitate violence, even though there can be violent and non-violent uprisings. For example, if you supported broadly the international campaign that opposed apartheid in South Africa, you were engaging in an intifada. That was resistance. That was a shaking off for the people who were confined to the Bantustans in South Africa. That didn't necessarily, in all cases, engage in violence, right? And she would have supported the actions that we took in this country to oppose apartheid in South Africa. So she's just talking abject nonsense there whilst failing to pronounce the word that she's trying to suggest she knows the meaning of. Ferrari then asked her about another story that's been doing the rounds today.
So you will share the dismay of many that the BBC described the Intifada on its website as largely unarmed and popular.
I mean, I haven't seen that, but look, to me, when you say when people start shouting things like "globalise the Intifada," the connotation is clear.
Now, what Nick Ferrari is referring to is an article the BBC published on the 17th regarding the discourse around the term Intifada that originally included some context around the term and its history and use as part of the Israel-Palestine conflict. This was the original text. The term Intifada came into popular use during the Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 1987. It was a largely unarmed and popular uprising that continued until the early 1990s. The Intifada also saw the development of groups outside the control of the PLO, notably Hamas. The Second Intifada began in September 2000 after a controversial visit by Ariel Sharon, then opposition leader, to a holy site in Jerusalem. It is sometimes called the Al-Aqsa Intifada, after the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the Haram al-Sharif site, known to Jews as the Temple Mount. So, this is an inarguable fact. The First Intifada was led by the PLO, who were explicit in that it should be unarmed. It involved strikes, boycotts, protests, and direct action. All of the same kind of non-violent resistance employed to globally isolate and oppose apartheid South Africa, as I mentioned before. And that's not to say that there was no violence at all in the First Intifada. The Palestinians refer to it as the Stones Intifada, due to the fact a common civil disobedience tactic during the uprising was to hurl stones at the IDF occupiers. And the IDF responded by killing 1,200 civilians between 1987 and 1993, according to B'Tselem, and 241 of those were children. Now, what the article should probably say is that the Second Intifada, as was pointed out, known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada to the Palestinians, did see widespread violence against Israeli civilians, such as suicide bombings, even though many Palestinians continued unarmed direct action at the same time. But pro-Israel agitators can't let facts get in the way of a good wine, and a flurry of complaints made the BBC edit the story to remove this important context. This is what it now reads. The term Intifada came into popular use during the Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 1987. Some have described the term as a call for violence against Jewish people. Others have said it's a call for peaceful resistance to Israel's occupation of the West Bank and actions in Gaza. An earlier version of this article sought to explain the wider background to the Met and GMP announcement by referring to the first Palestinian Intifada, including the description that it was largely unarmed, and the Second Intifada. However, the language used in this brief summary did not give a clear enough or complete picture of the history, and so this section has been amended to instead explain the context around the ongoing use of the term. Now, this is ridiculous, right? So what they've done there is taken away actual real-life context, which was correct, right? The First Intifada was largely unarmed, was very popular, and there were some attacks on civilians in the later years of the First Intifada, but broadly, for the most part, it was unarmed and mostly civil disobedience rather than violent clashes until the IDF clamped down by massacring civilians in lots of cases, engaging in murders of civilians. That was the main violence started in the First Intifada. And that's all been removed because, they weren't clear enough to delineate that from the Second Intifada, which did have more violence against civilians, some terrorist attacks, really, with bus bombings, suicide bombings, and the like. And now all we've got left is just people's opinions. All the actual facts removed, replaced with nothing but opinions, because people can't understand the difference between unbiased and neutral. So this forced neutrality, where we go, well, some people think this, some people think this, would never get employed in other situations, right? You would have a flat Earth article on the BBC, well, some people think it's flat, some people think that it's an oblate spheroid, who knows? When they would actually lay out the facts of the case. And this is what's going to be the long-term problem with the Prescott memo that talked about the biases of the BBC, which I think, when you look at the kind of totality of the BBC's output, real nonsense. But what it is it's showing that right-wingers are allowed to kind of browbeat the BBC into printing what their opinions are, regardless of the veracity of those opinions, rather than actually printing detailed explanations of the facts. And we'll see this continually more as the BBC self-censors to appease the mob. Dalia, what do you make of what's happened with all of the discourse around the globalise, the Intifada, the arrests, and this edited BBC article?
It's frankly laughable to watch Jess Phillips appoint herself the expert on a word that she can't even pronounce, on a context that she doesn't understand, and a language that she cannot speak. What we saw there was not an insightful analysis of what a term like Intifada might have come to mean. What we see there is an analysis that is dripping in racism, because what we heard there was Jess Phillips saying, when I hear someone scream, globalise the Intifada, I feel X, Y, Z. I feel like that has to mean violence. And that emerges from the view that inherently receives Arabs and the Arabic language as innately, mindlessly violent. It's the same that happened with the term Allahu Akbar, which is like an incredibly standard, turn of phrase in the Arab world, in the Arab language, that is used in so many different contexts, that has come to be seen as a symbol of mindless Arab violence wherever it is just deployed. And the fact is that this has happened throughout history. This ascribing of malicious context and intent to the symbols of a movement is a textbook form of counterinsurgency. And the fact is that the British state finds the steadfastness of the Palestinian solidarity movement deeply confusing. I don't think that Jess Phillips and others like her understand how, despite decades of Israeli propaganda, despite decades of demonizing of Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims more generally, decades of stigmatizing people who support Palestine, how, despite all of that soft power that has been thrown at the global solidarity movement, how we have ended up in a situation where solidarity with Palestine is stronger than it has ever been. I mean, we have seen hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets on a weekly basis. We've seen so many people participating in boycotts, people risking arrest, risking job loss, in some cases risking their lives, with the hunger strikers who are currently in prison. And all that to oppose Israeli occupation and Israeli genocide. And all of that despite everything we have been told about who the Palestinians are and what they represent. And when that soft power, that kind of cultural, social, and political coercion, when that fails, you then turn to hard power and you look for any way to criminalize even the most banal acts of solidarity, like a slogan or a sign. And it reminds me of when Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who were two Black American Olympians who raised their fist in a Black Power salute during the 1968 Summer Olympics, which we now look back at as like an iconic act of righteous resistance. I mean, there are statues of that salute dotted all around the US, and it was an iconic act of resistance. It happened against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, where Black Americans were fighting to end legal segregation. They were fighting for racial justice through civil disobedience, and yes, at times through breaking unjust laws. But at the time, that gesture was literally described as a violent act. The International Olympic Committee literally called it a deliberate and violent breach of the fundamental Olympian spirit, whatever that means, because the president of the IOC had nothing to say when Nazi salutes were being raised at the 1936 Olympics, but raising a Black Power fist in solidarity with Black Americans fighting for basic civil rights was literally described as a violent act. And this is what happens when the state cannot win the argument, when it tries to crush popular dissent, when it's tried to crush it through soft power and then has to turn to hard power. It ascribes the slogans and symbols of a movement with violent, threatening associations as a precursor to criminalizing them and stigmatizing that solidarity out of public life. And it's textbook, and it's the way in which, in these moments where movements gain power in this way, that the state has to turn reality on its head. And we see people who have backed the most insane, unboundaried, mass forms of systematic violence turn around and say that the way that a particular word or a particular symbol can be violent, in the same way that, a drone strike or a fighter jet can be violent. It's not surprising. It's not unusual. It has happened against the Black civil rights movement, and it's now happening against the Palestinian civil rights movement. And I think in many ways we should take inspiration from that and know that, in 20 years, we're going to look back at Jess Phillips calling the word intifada violent in the midst of one of the most insane spectacles of violence we've seen in our living memory, we're going to look back in the same way that we look back at the IOC calling the raising of the Black Power fist at the Olympics a violent act.
Susie Wiles is US President Donald Trump's chief of staff, the first woman to hold that position in the White House. Widely regarded as the second most powerful person in Washington, she's seen as a Trump loyalist who stuck with him since the beginning of his first presidential campaign. When others abandoned him after the January 6th insurrection, Wiles stuck by Trump's side. But it turns out she may not be that loyal after all. Over the past year, Wiles has spoken very candidly and very on the record with Vanity Fair writer Chris Whipple, revealing the chaos and court intrigues at the heart of the Trump administration. She's provided so much material, in fact, that the article has been published in 2 parts. This is one extract from the piece. Trump, she told me, has an alcoholic's personality. Vance's conversion from never Trumper to MAGA acolyte, she said, has been sort of political. The vice president, she added, has been a conspiracy theorist for a decade. Russell Vought, architect of the notorious Project 2025 and head of the Office of Management and Budget, is a right-wing absolute zealot. When I asked her what she thought of Musk reposting a tweet about public sector workers killing millions under Hitler, Stalin and Mao, she replied, "I think that's when he's microdosing." She says she doesn't have first-hand knowledge. One topic explored at length is Trump's relationship to the Epstein files, with the article saying this. Wiles told me she underestimated the potency of the scandal, whether he was an American CIA asset, a Mossad asset, whether all these rich, important men went to that nasty island and did unforgivable things to young girls. She said, "I mean, I kind of knew it, but it's never anything I paid a bit of attention to." Wiles told me she'd read what she calls the Epstein file, and she said, Trump is in the file, and we know he's in the file, and he's not in the file doing anything awful. Wiles said that Trump was on Epstein's plane, he's on the manifest. They were, sort of young, single, whatever. I know it's a passé word, but sort of young, single playboys together. The people that are inordinately interested in Epstein are the new members of the Trump coalition, the people I think about at the time, because I want to make sure that they are not Trump voters, they're Republican voters, Wiles said. It's the Joe Rogan listeners. It's the people that are sort of new to our world. It's not the MAGA base. Other topics include the Trump tariffs, the Gaza plan, and the use of ICE to round up and deport undocumented immigrants. It also covers Trump's attacks on civilian boats off the Venezuelan coast, with the 87 people so far killed in drone strikes being described as narco-terrorists. This is from the article. Over lunch, Wiles told me about Trump's Venezuela strategy. He wants to keep on blowing up boats until Maduro cries uncle, and people way smarter than me on that say that he will. Wiles' statement appears to contradict the administration's official stance that blowing up boats is about drug interdiction, not regime change. Some of Wiles' most colourful descriptions are of ex-owner Elon Musk, whose evisceration of US international aid programs she is highly critical of. It also includes this description of the billionaire. He's a complete solo actor, said Wiles of Trump's billionaire pal, who led the scorched earth blitz known as the Department of Government Efficiency. Wiles described Musk as something akin to a jacked-up Nosferatu. The challenge with Elon is keeping up with him, she told me. He's an avowed ketamine user, and he sleeps in a sleeping bag in the executive office building in the daytime. And he's an odd duck, as I think geniuses are. It's not helpful, but he is his own person. Quite a liberal use of the word genius there, in my opinion. Now, the publication of the article in Vanity Fair took all of Washington by surprise. Wiles responded with this. The article published early this morning is a disingenuously framed hit piece on me and the finest president, White House staff and cabinet in history. Significant context was disregarded, and much of what I and others said about the team and the president was left out of the story. I assume, after reading it, that this was done to paint an overwhelmingly chaotic and negative narrative about the president and our team. The truth is that the White House has already accomplished more in 11 months than any other president has accomplished in 8 years, and that is due to the unmatched leadership and vision of President Trump, for whom I have been honoured to work for the better part of a decade. None of us will stop our relentless pursuit of making America great again. Seems like a lot of arse covering from Susan there, in my opinion, because a lot of this stuff, we kind of already had guessed. I don't think anyone's surprised to learn that Elon Musk is on ketamine, for example, or indeed that J.D. Vance acts like a conspiracy theorist. I mean, we can all see it with our own eyes. It's just nice to have it confirmed in writing with someone close to the administration. Dalia, what did you make of these revelations? If they're not surprising, they are certainly entertaining.
I have to say, I am quite perplexed by Susan Wiles sort of saying, they printed exactly what I said verbatim, and that makes this a hit piece. And it's like, okay, yes, them printing exactly what you said verbatim has been quite damaging for you because the things that you said were insane. But I think, it's surprising because whenever anyone who's involved in politics or anywhere near the media knows that anything you say, like any whole sentence that you say to a journalist, can and will be printed verbatim, especially if it's as salacious as saying, Trump is in the Epstein files, we all know he is, or Elon Musk is on ketamine. Wasn't born yesterday. I'm surprised to think that she would be that naive. But on the question of it looking chaotic, I think that, yes, like just because something looks and seems chaotic doesn't necessarily mean that it is not achieving what it is set out to achieve. And I think a lot of the chaos of Trump's current presidency is a form of engineered chaos, because when we look at the kind of heart of what the Trump presidency is trying to achieve, it's essentially to finish the job that was started by Thatcher and that many of his neoliberal predecessors had been trying to do, which is to completely transform the nature of the state, to decimate the post-war welfare and regulating state, and to bolster the parts of the state that can discipline and criminalize without restraint. That has been the goal of the Trump presidency, and that is not an entirely significant break from what many of his particularly Republican predecessors had been trying to achieve. I just don't think that they felt like they could go as hard and fast as Trump is going. And, they do it under the guise of cutting DEI or government inefficiency or whatever, but ultimately it is about a neoliberal reorganization of the state. And that is going to look chaotic. It is going to be chaotic. It is going to have a move fast and break things kind of energy. And I think there is a playing with chaos and playing with a spectacle of chaos, because there has to be a kind of cloud of unpredictability that is ultimately confusing and distracting to the public, whilst ensuring that nothing that you do actually upsets those who have the power to stop you, because it is ultimately aligned with what many of the political and financial elite in the US and more globally want, which is less regulation, no welfare state, and increased punitive powers of the state. What I think might have happened here is maybe Susan Wiles got a little bit carried away with how comfortable this administration has been in projecting a kind of chaotic disregard for norms, and instead has maybe stepped over the line a little bit, because I don't think that it's in the plan to out Elon Musk's alleged ketamine problem.
That's true. I think that's very, very true there. And the problem, of course, is that when it comes to what they've done, I mean, you look at the Doge cuts to US aid, and of course, it's a very kind of famous soft power institution that the US uses, but for all the bad things that it does, what Elon Musk didn't cut that stuff. What he did cut was stuff that was there to feed hundreds of thousands of people, and that's led to deaths, huge numbers of deaths in the global south. And when you listen to what she's saying, she obviously doesn't support that. She doesn't support the cutting away of US soft power through aid programs. And she said it herself, like, I'm not here to get people to become Trumpists. I'm here to get people to become Republicans. And she knows that there's a post-Trump future, right? She knows there's a post-Trump future, and ensuring that it's clear that once that happens, there needs to be a through line from the callous disregard for even basic tenets of the Constitution from the current administration, that wanting to temper that and at least be able to make sure that the people who are currently in charge don't totally undermine the Republican Party's image more broadly to their new electorate she's talking about there, then that will be the future that she is looking towards. Because her role as an advisor, as a chief of staff, that has legs. Donald Trump's career as a politician, that ends in 3 years' time. Now, the Vanity Fair article may be pretty wild, but it's nowhere near as wild as the photographs that accompany it. Photographer Christopher Anderson, who's an experienced political photographer, very clearly had something to say when he took these diabolical pictures, and it's nothing good. Take this one, for example, a tightly cropped, untouched up shot of 28-year-old White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. According to dermatologists and a plastic surgeon who spoke to the cut, those dots around her lips are injection marks, presumably for recent filler. Not airbrushing them out seems pretty deliberate. There's this less than flattering extreme close-up of Vice President J.D. Vance, though he at least appears to have had a sense of humour about it. According to the Daily Beast, he quipped during the shoot, "I'll give you $100 for every person you make look really shitty compared to me, and $1,000 if it's Marco Rubio, although I assume you probably get denied entry to the US if you have this on your phone." There's also this portrait of Dan Scavino, Trump's deputy chief of staff, which seems pretty focused on, let's just say, his distinctive hairstyle. Scavino was formerly Trump's head of social media and is credited with having used Twitter to connect the president with white nationalists and the alt-right. Dalia, would you be happy if in a big multi-page spread they'd use photos of you that look like this?
I mean, on the one hand, when I first saw these pictures, I was like, who cares? Like, I don't think anyone would come off well in that extreme a close-up. And like, I don't care if the White House press secretary has a somewhat questionable lip filler, injector, whatever. But the great irony of it is I think that more than anything else in this piece, this will have aggravated Trump more than anything. Because whilst I don't necessarily care what his press secretary looks like, Trump most certainly does. Trump is very, very obsessed, and the whole MAGA project is very, very obsessed with aesthetics, and not just any aesthetics, but the aesthetics of women that represent the project. That's why we have this sort of Mar-a-Lago face where, you know, women kind of go in looking sort of like normal human women, and then they come out the other side with the identical shade of blonde, you know, and a very particular hyper femme, like blonde American look. And that is a really important part of the political project of MAGA. It is very much about, you know, projecting an idea that this is what an American woman looks like. And there's something about there being a close-up, you know, when the fact that when you look at that under a microscope, not only is it artificial, but actually when you really look at it, it looks quite strange and it looks quite unappealing. It's actually a very brilliant photographic move. And it's something that Trump will have understood as a slight, not just on these individuals, but on the political project as a whole, quite effectively. You know, it reminds me of, you know, Trump kind of comes from the Fox News school of doing politics. And, you know, Roger Ailes famously, who was the CEO and chairman of Fox News, famously would watch Fox News with the sound off, because as far as he was concerned, the aesthetics of the political project were as important as anything that anyone was saying. And there's something quite genius about showing that not only is it artificial, but when you look at it really up close, it's quite unappealing.
Now, it is quite funny to me because I hear very frequently, or at least I read very frequently in the comment sections, lots of conservatives, especially Republicans and MAGA conservatives, will say things like, I love being a right-winger, I love being a conservative because our women are much more attractive than the liberal women. I'm like, well, I may be ugly, but at least I'm not a fascist. Being the UK Christmas #1 is a yearly prize that's highly sought after, from the Spice Girls' dominance of the 90s to X Factor's reign of terror in the 2000s, and a succession of bakery-themed novelty charity songs from the YouTubers Lad Baby. This year is no different, and there are 3 songs vying for the top spot. Firstly is a seasonal classic Last Christmas by Wham, which has been #1 the last 2 years. Secondly is Australian pop icon Kylie Minogue, with a new single imaginatively titled Xmas, replete with its own YMCA-style dance moves and festive lyrics. Lastly, something rather more meaningful. A charity single has been a mainstay of a Christmas singles chart race, but this one in particular is very special. Lullaby is a reworking of a Palestinian folk song by the Together for Palestine Fund, with added English lyrics by British prog rock legend Peter Gabriel, and featuring famous artists such as Brian Eno, Nene Cherry, Amina, Bastille, Leanne Pinnock from Little Mix, and many others. The arrangement and composition, however, is a joint effort between composer Kieran Blunt and Palestinian singer, songwriter and flautist Nai Barghouti, and she joined me earlier today to discuss the single.
I'm actually very excited about this single, The Lullaby, with a group of the incredible artists that are part of it and that have come all together and gathered all together to be for Palestine, to sing for Palestine. I think it's been getting such important global attention, which is the goal of this, is to speak about Palestine and show the beauty of Palestine.
So Lullaby is a reworking of a Palestinian folk song. What does the original mean for you personally?
So the lullaby in Arabic is called Yomam Wil Hawa, and it's basically a song for a mother, a song about Palestinian love and what it means to be living under borders, under occupation, not being able to unite with those that you love. And so a part of the song that says, I wish my chest were a bridge so that you and I you can cross over and you and I can live a Palestinian love story together. And that really speaks of the so many love stories that have ended because of illegal occupation, and they just don't get the chance to be together. And this song has been really connected with me from a very young age for some reason. Recorded it at many different projects, and also I try to sing it in whichever stage I go to around the world.
And you're calling in today from Ramallah. Can you tell us what the situation's like on the ground for you there?
It's really like, waiting for a storm or post a storm. It feels sometimes very calm, sometimes very chaotic, but there's such a sense of fear, a sense of loss, a sense of sadness. You really see it on people's faces, in people's eyes. I haven't been here in a year and a half. So just seeing my friends, seeing the faces of people, you can really see a lot of grief, which of course is expected, and it's for everybody inside and outside of Palestine, but especially here, feeling always at risk and always at, on the edge that things would change any minute. So it's just really, very anxious.
A lot of those emotions definitely will come through in a lot of the reactions, and there are a lot of the discussion around the reasons why we need the single in the first place. I mean, how did you come to be a part of how the song was created in the first place?
Well, it actually started back in September when we were planning for the Together for Palestine big event at the OVO Arena, Wembley in London. And I was going to be part of this event, and I heard that there's this idea about doing this lullaby as a collective project and bringing together many different artists that would help bring this lullaby to reach as many people as possible. So of course, for me, it was really really important to be part of it and to help shape the overall artistic vision of the song, the rearrangement of it, and how everything will come together from the different genres that you hear on the track, that it still becomes a one sound, comes in unity at the end result.
The recording would have been done from all different places. Were there any challenges in recording, essentially a song globally in this way?
Well, a lot of it happened in London. Parts of my own vocals were recorded in London. The rest was in Amsterdam. I think there's always a bit of, some tricky situations and challenges that happen when people record in different places, and just to make the sound really match from a very technical point of view. But I think once everybody's hearts is just in the right place and in the right, work ethics and the right goal that we all want, it really becomes like a seamless experience.
I mean, especially given the people that are on board, yourself and the many other kind of stars that were involved in the making of this, I can imagine it being a very, very rewarding process. What's your message to those watching at home? Of course, this is in the running for the Christmas #1, which is a kind of a big event in this country. But obviously, the proceeds are going to be going to a really important charity. So everyone who does buy the single at home will be helping to aid in the relief in Gaza. What's your message to people at home watching about the song and about what that's going to mean for the people in Gaza and the people broadly in Palestine?
Well, I think it's like a little beam of light at a time that feels very dark, and at a time where we really need people to speak of Palestine and to work as hard as possible, and especially now, We really need to keep going with that. And I think it also shows a part of Palestine that is not always mentioned in the news. And that's the part that is very beautiful and just full of art, full of beauty. Our art is sophisticated, it's deep, it's very complex as well, and very pure and very honest. And just bringing all these different elements in one song, featuring so many beautiful voices that come together, I think it's just everything we really need to convey, which is the unity and the strength and the resilience and the hope that lies in every Palestinian.
That was Nai Barghouti speaking to me earlier today. Lullaby is at time of recording only 7,000 units behind Kylie, who's in first place. So if you want to see the single as Christmas #1, you have until 11:59 on the 18th to download it for it to count. And the results are due to be announced on the official chart show on BBC Radio 1 at 3 p.m. on Friday the 19th. And remember, the proceeds from Lullaby go to a selection of Palestinian relief charities. And given the situation in Gaza, every penny counts. The download link will be in the description. Thank you, Dalia, for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me, Helena.
Always a pleasure. Always look forward to my Thursdays with you every week. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. with yours truly in the co-host seat. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.